Yeah.
Oh, shucks. Well, well, well.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. I am so glad to be joined this evening by two of my absolute favorite people. The one and only, I call him the Bishop Stephen York, out of that great state of Maine. He is a Pentecostal preacher at heart. By way of background, uh, Steve is not just a brother, but a friend, beloved from Colgate Crozer, one of the brightest brothers I've ever met. And I am so glad he's joined us on this discussion, and you'll see why shortly. And then, of course, to have my professor, my mentor, um, just a solid scholar. And I think the world has not seen yet what is going to come from the mind, and I would say the pen, but now it's the computer, of Dr. Joseph Evans, Dean of Morehouse School of Religion. Um, Gentlemen, welcome aboard. Thank you for taking time out on a Sunday to talk about something that I thought might interest a number of folks because I see it happening more and more as you look. You are seeing folks about the late author James Baldwin. With that said, I would encourage folks, if they have a chance to go out, pick up a copy of Lifting the Veil Over Eurocentrism, the Du Boisian Hermeneutic, a book that was written by Dr. Evans, as well as his most recent reparations, preaching economic justice. And then he has another one that is due out anytime now on the wisdom and the breath of one of our favorites, Dr. Gardner Taylor. Um, my good friend York has a book that will soon be out that you should be on the lookout for as well. So while we're preparing for those things to come, again, Baldwin, I want you guys to share with us your experience with the breadth of Baldwin's work, from Go Tell It on the Mountain to Giovanni's Room, Another Country, Notes of a Native Son, but then sort of hang your hat at the place for which our discussion will take place today, not just any of Baldwin's work, but the specific essays where he writes about the fire next time. So if you would share your experience with that, and then why is there, in your opinion, this renewed interest in Baldwin's work? I'll start with you, Bishop. Well, I call him Bishop, but Reverend Stephen York.
Well, I came to Baldwin because of a friend suggesting to me that my religious heritage had a lot in common with Baldwin's. I was reared in the holiness Pentecostal tradition, and as we know from Baldwin's early life, Baldwin was a teenage Pentecostal preacher, which was not uncommon in those days. He began preaching at Mother Rosa Horn's church and went on to Fireside Pentecostal Assembly. And there were a number of things that I saw as I began to read his literature, both his fiction, Go Tell It on the Mountain, his play, The Amen Corner, and then his essays, including the collection, The Fire Next Time. In the letter to the nephew, which I know we'll get into in a moment, he talks twice in that letter to his nephew about the holiness, use the word holiness there. So in order to perfectly, or not perfectly, but more completely understand Baldwin, I've taken to look at him through the lens of the African-American holiness Pentecostal tradition on him. And his story, as Clarence Hardy III wrote about Baldwin, his story and my story, there were some parallels. Albeit I want to fully say that I'm a Caucasian and Baldwin was black. but the theology of the sanctified church was something I saw throughout his writings, his choice of titles, etc. So that's what brought me to Baldwin.
Yeah, yeah. And why do you think there's this renewed interest in his work?
Because he being dead, as it says in the book of Hebrews, yet speaks. His message is relevant. You know, that verse from Hebrews talks about the premature death of Abel, and he being dead yet speaks. And I think that Baldwin died at the age of 63, which was tragically too soon in our laws. But his work is still relevant, and it's becoming even more relevant because times have not changed. Many of the issues that he addressed in his work are still prevalent today.
Yes. Dr. Evans.
Well, first of all, hey, thanks for having us, Dr. York. Good to see you, and of course, Dr. Slade, two of my favorite folk. And I want to also commend you on your Marcus Miller that you were playing in our intro.
Thank you. It's Sunday.
Only a true aficionado of jazz could connect the dots between Marcus Miller and Miles Davis. Only you could do that, Dr. Slade.
Thank you.
And that demonstrates that you have systematic theology in you. We're just going to pull it out. Let's talk about Baldwin and how he affected me and is continuing to influence me. Growing up in the African-American church tradition, I certainly was not unfamiliar with people from the Literate, particularly if you think about Ralph Ellison. He would come to mind. Richard Wright would come to mind. Zora Neale Hurston would come to mind. And of course, adding to that would be James Baldwin. Baldwin is influential in many ways, and some of the essays in and of themselves, that is in a separate fashion. In other words, if they were taken out, some of the books that he published would stand on their own in a Rima word, frankly, in a very relevant word today. So let's think about 1963, for example. And I believe that was the year that Fire Next Time was actually published.
That's it.
Maybe his second volume, I think. Expatriate in England, in France. And I think he may have written Fire Next Time both in France and in maybe Switzerland, where he would oftentimes need to get away from folks to really reflect, as the Harlem Renaissance writers before him had felt that they had to leave the country to reflect on the unrest in the United States. Mm-hmm. So in 1963, let's think about that for a moment. The Birmingham March took place in 1963. The March on Washington took place in 1963. And then the Fire Next Time comes like a blaze on the literary scene. That book, among others, has not only caught my attention, but it's kept my attention for a long time. The title is amazing. It demonstrates, as Dr. York was speaking to, and rightly so, the influence of the Black church and obviously the Pentecostal church. One could say that it's a Noahic writing. It's a Noahic writing. You think about Noah as telling us that, the world is saved. It was destroyed by water, the rainbow in the sky. And then he alludes that the next time it will be by fire. Mm-hmm. And I believe it's in 2 Peter, I think, chapter 3, verse 7, where Peter picks up on that theme and reminds us that the God will come with justice is fire next time. So I would argue that the very title is metaphoric signifying, if you will, for justice. And I think that we could safely surmise that we're experiencing the fire next time now.
Yeah, I actually, when I thought about this, what inspired it was not only the title, but the idea that it was not the fire next time, but the fire this time.
Mm.
As I watched the various news channels, the many of the protesters in various places were setting things ablaze. But I want to sort of go. I want to start there with the conversation. Here you have two essays. One, the dungeon shook, and that is the letter to the nephew. And then there is down at the cross, um, which is, I think, York spent a lot of time working with this encounter, this unique encounter that Baldwin had with the church. I won't just say the black church, but more specifically, the Pentecostal black church. And so I want to ask um, you, York, what might Baldwin's nephew have responded back to Baldwin today about the role of race in America based on what is Baldwin tried to inform him or school him on about race in '63?
Well, the nephew, when the letter was written uh, to the nephew, uh, the young nephew was 15 years of age,
Mhm.
and so born in 1950, the nephew was. Now the man would be 70 years of age this year. The nephew. I did try to find him on and came up with a different nephew, but I didn't find the one that was named. He was the namesake of James Baldwin, so his name too was James. And
My wife, she said, Dia said, I bet you Steve's gonna go find the nephew.
well, I made a valiant attempt. All right, Dr. Slayton, I made a valiant attempt, Dr. Evans, and not that I'm giving up, but I think that there were several things, and as Dr. Evans has pointed out correctly, in the beginning of the book, uh, Baldwin has this quotation where he talks about Noah and and the judgment that's going to come. Now, in the letter to the nephew, one of the things that was very clear to me was that he starts out by talking about the nephew's grandfather, which would be Baldwin's stepfather.
Mhm.
And he said one of the problems that he struggled with was believing what the white person, how the white person defined him. And so that's part of the letter that he writes, and he's admonishing the young nephew at the time not to allow himself to be defined by what the white person says and the world. I think there was another quote I read this week where Baldwin said part of the problem is half of the world thinks the whole world is white. And so he begins with that. And he also talks about this, what E. Franklin Frazier called the cities of destruction. So he's concerned in a familial sense for the nephew, doesn't want the nephew or any black person in America to buy into what the whites are saying and how they're being defined. And he also gets into uh, this notion of they're going to try to put you in a position from birth to tell you what you can do, where you can go, how you can, who you can see, and who to marry, even. And so he really gets into some kind of very wise sage wisdom for this nephew. Don't let the white person do that to you. I think in response, the nephew would have to say that times have not changed. We still have these things going on to date in 2020, and I think that's the biggest question. That's the biggest problem we're facing right now. Things have not changed dramatically.
As I consider the letter, Dr. Evans, could we agree that, we have a saying now amongst ourselves and amongst communities, blacks and whites, that a lot of parents are having to have the talk. Was this the talk before the talk? And if it was, what was missing then that might have been helpful to young folks today?
Well, the talk has existed since 1619.
Yeah, probably.
This is not original with
Yeah.
James Baldwin.
Mm.
The essay to his nephew. So think of it this way. At least this is how I'm thinking about it. James Baldwin could be using his nephew in addition to talking to him literally. It is also a symbol. It's a trope. We know that because Tanisha Coates had a similar talk with his own son, Baldwin with his nephew, Coates with his son,
Mm-hmm.
to give to us a perspective or a picture of how time itself has moved on, but the social circumstances in our society has not changed very much. The both pieces, one could say, parallel the other, or certainly Coates parallels Baldwin.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, Baldwin is addressing he's addressing his anxieties over his nephew developing double consciousness, the very thing that keeps one, let us say, the oppressed, psychologically feeling she or he is inferior to the oppressor. There's language there. I think it says something about a black man's inferiority is connected with a white man's inhumanity. That's a very nice trope or couplet that Baldwin uses. Baldwin was a master of metaphor and extended metaphor, right? And so he helps his readers understand that in order to impose upon the victim or the oppressed a hegemonic, supremacist, psychological warfare, the damage that is being done to, in this instance, Mr. Baldwin's nephew, that same damage is happening to the oppressor, in fear of losing one's humanity. And I find that an amazing, so it's a juxtaposition, right? Baldwin was really writing a letter in context, in my view, here for all of us who came up in those situations. I can remember having that talk with my father, and I had it more than once, because each stage that I grew up, it was the talk got more sophisticated, right? I had more challenges. I had more liberalities to go outside of the house and to do other things. So the talk oftentimes became more sophisticated. But I think that's what Baldwin has done. He has given the larger society perhaps a bird's eye view into what takes place in Black homes. And if I may, just in brief, Dr. Slayton and Dr. York, and I'll throw it back to both of you, I suspect that those talks are happening again right now based on current circumstances that are taking place across America.
That indeed they are. I've witnessed a number of programs that have focused on that talk specifically. The other essay, shifting just a little bit, deals with the church. Baldwin had a unique relationship, love, hate, if you will, with the church. Um, must have been a very interesting time to grow up in the Pentecostal church. Um, but the question I have is, has the Christian church been oppressive in a way that it has prohibited the progress of the black church? And if so, in what ways? And then how might have Baldwin described that then? Describe it now.
So
Either of you.
is that open to both Dr. York
Yeah,
and to me?
that's open to both.
Okay. Well, I think we need to begin. Let's begin with the broader perspective on the church in my view. And this is not just a critique of the African American church in America, which of course was born out of protest, right? And so the black church at her best is a liberation church that resists empire and hegemonic forms of oppression. But the church at large has always moved slowly because I feel the church doesn't think she can be wrong, cannot make too many theological shifts too soon, I think some would feel. And that, of course, is more of a Eurocentric model of the church because many people in the white tradition, in my experience, want to reform the church or reform society, whereas I don't think that's the order of the day. It has to be transformation. I don't think reformation is going to work because we're going to be continuing to play inside of a box where there's no transcendence. Baldwin, and I want to let Dr. York handle Baldwin from his perspective, in part his relationship with the church. So I think I will just sort of talk about this. There was an essay, one of my favorite essays that Baldwin had ever written was when he went to Atlanta to meet with Dr. King. I think it was in 1963. I think it was in 63. It was right before they were going to do the Birmingham March, the dangerous road before Martin Luther King Jr. I think it first appeared in Harper's. Mm-hmm. And Baldwin, I think, felt that King and King's philosophy on the activism of the church gave Baldwin a new hope in what the church could be, right? And I think that at that point, Baldwin understood that, and that maybe his worldview of the church, and I will leave the theological part for now to Dr. York, but perhaps his theological worldview was not as broad as it became later when he started meeting different people who from different branches of the black church. And we all know, and anyone who will be watching this broadcast, we all know that the black church is sometimes really not in step with society. And part of that is because we have more of a white theology in our church. It's a Reformation theology, I'll call it, than a liberation theology. But I think Baldwin's critique of the church really had a lot to do with how he felt the church treated him in his orientation years and his development in his early years. So by the time he gets to King, he sees something that's taking place that reunites or reignites his faith walk. So I think that's where I plug into Baldwin's worldview at the time, and
Doc,
how it evolved,
Dr. York, I think you have a unique insight into this particular question, as I know you did a great deal of work on Baldwin and his background in the Pentecostal church. What might he describe um, the oppressive nature um, of the church on the progress of Black folk then, and certainly on him personally? But how might he view that now?
Well, I've written extensively on this, as you know. Let me begin by going back to, if I may, to Azusa Street in 1906, which was the birth with William Seymour, who was an African American preacher who was in Los Angeles at the Azusa Street Mission. All of Pentecostalism was birthed from that revival, which took place from 1906 to 1909. But from the beginning, so you had people like Charles H. Mason, founder of the Church of God in Christ, and others who came out of that revival and went on to do some pretty marvelous things. It's important to know that the Azusa Street revival was multiracial. It was not segregated. I listened this week to Dr. Vincent Synan, who's a Pentecostal historian that just passed away. He was at Oral Roberts University until a couple of months ago, and he just died. I heard him interview two of the last individuals who were at Azusa Street. This interview took place in, I think, 1974. And they described how it was multiracial. So when Charles and international, and so when Charles Mason left there, he went back and to where he was from and began to preach what was called the full gospel. And he started the Church of God in Christ. And that was an interracial denomination. And in fact, he was legally savvy, and he was the only one in the United States who was legally authorized by the state of Tennessee to ordain anyone who wanted to be a Pentecostal minister. So the 300 white ministers were ordained under Charles H. Mason. And eventually, because of Jim Crow laws and pressures in the South, and people like Charles Parham and others, who was a racist, caused this division, and they went and founded what became the Assemblies of God. And at that point, churches in the holiness movement began to separate between the races. So by the time Baldwin wants to leave the Harlem streets, he sees the church as a refuge. It's a white friend of his who says, "Come with my family to Mother Rosa Horn's church." And he ends up there, and he's looking for salvation from the street. And he's not satisfied to just be a member, so he begins to preach. And this is really recounted in his thinly veiled autobiographical biography, Go Tell It on the Mountain. So from the beginning, systemically, there was racism in the church. Why Baldwin left the church was because he saw its hypocrisy. You had Father Divine, you had Daddy Grace, and these were prosperity-style preachers that were padding their wallets and fleecing the flock. And Baldwin looked primarily at at both the hypocrisy and the lack of love in the church. And he saw that as being in all the churches. that were holiness. And so, as his biographer said, David Leeming said, the boy preacher left the church to save his own soul. And so he did feel oppressed. He did feel like, and there were other things that were going on, his own awareness of his sexuality. So while he was at DeWitt Clinton High School, where he got a college education at the high school level, he had tremendous teachers there. He was active in what was called the Magpie, their literary magazine, and he began to write short stories about the church and its hypocrisies and whatever. And one thing led to another. And finally, because it was a predominantly Jewish population at the high school, and he had gospel tracts that were saying that Jews were going to go to hell if they didn't know Jesus, he couldn't buy that anymore. And so he began to leave. And so the hypocrisy and the oppression and the lack of love, which was Baldwin's primary message throughout his life, was why he got out of the church. I agree with Dr. Evans that he evolved again. He came to a broader understanding. And there are two things that come to mind. At the time of his death, he died on December 1st in 1987. When after the funeral at the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine, Baldwin's brothers sent David Leeming back to France, said, get his papers and whatever. And there was a cross on the mantle in Baldwin's home in France. There were gospel albums in his record collection. And to the shock of everyone at his funeral service, and there were 5,000 people at the funeral there in New York City, he had a tape recording, pre-recorded, of himself singing Precious Lord, Take My Hand. So it's been my theory that while he left the church experience didn't leave him. And it's recounted in the titles he used, the metaphors and extended metaphors that Dr. Evans has referenced are very strongly within the church.
I like that. Much of Baldwin's critique on racism in America was centered clearly, as both of you have stated, on his personal experiences, primarily in Harlem, New York. Dr. Evans, I'm going to ask you this, and you'll see why in just a second. How do you feel that? And I'm not going to say his focus was singularly focused on his experience in New York, but it was great. It was weighty for him. But do you think he missed the significance and the similarities of white poverty in places like West Virginia and rural Mississippi? And how might he have viewed this seemingly dismantling of what we would call, what some have called the white trash syndrome? At least I'm not black. How he might have viewed that dismantling of that, in my perspective, in modern day society. I think we have hit a place where a good number of our white brothers and sisters have decided it's not just good enough to be better than black folk. We really have to see ourselves as equals. And I'm wondering if possibly Baldwin missed that window.
That's a good question, and I'll answer it this way. I'll do it deductively. I don't think he missed it. I was talking about that essay he wrote on King. It was actually in 1961 because he left Atlanta and went to Montgomery and experienced there a kind of racism that Baldwin may have never experienced in that direct fashion, as I recall him saying. Look, Baldwin was not naive. Baldwin understood what racism was and is. Let's not forget his time in the South, American South, but let's also remember Baldwin was probably, I would say that Baldwin was trying to escape two things in America. Number one was racism. Number two was to wrestle with his own identity. And he went to France. But over time in France, as much as the Harlem Renaissance writers who'd come before, Baldwin came to understand that France was very similar to America. Let's say that he went there, I think, in 1949, I think. So that was only 4 years after the liberation of France from World War II. And France was, of course, at that point, moving into Jean-Paul Sartre's post-structuralism, right? Absolute truth is not absolutely true in that philosophical construct. And so he goes to France, and he enjoys it for a long period of time until he came to terms that the Algerians who had come to Paris and other places, he remarks, were treated as poorly as blacks were in America. And therefore his view of France began to change. In fact, he said if he had not possession of his American passport, he too felt he may have been treated differently outside of his conclave and his circles. So I'm not prepared to say that he did not understand it. Baldwin was an extremely gifted storyteller, as all of us know on this call. And one of his finest hours, in my view, is when he went to Cambridge and spoke to the student union and debated Bill Buckley.
Right.
And I don't think, I mean, Baldwin was brilliant in many different platforms, but in that occasion, he was absolutely brilliant. And of course, Bill Buckley could not debate him any longer on facts. So he began to attack the man's person, which leads me to this last note. Where Baldwin is a little different than perhaps I would be. And we don't know, at this point, we have his writings and we have his recordings, his visual recordings and whatnot. And Baldwin may have a different view today. But Baldwin was also concerned about the class struggle. Baldwin oftentimes wanted to describe the social circumstances that he lived in his time, and perhaps we can argue that we're living in now. White supremacy needs a trope, needs a scapegoat. That's the word I'm looking for. And if we are concentrating on racism, don't get me wrong, racism is real. But if we can't get past racism, we cannot address classism. And I think Baldwin understood that very well.
Excellent response. During the two of the most recent, and I'm saying within the last 5 years or so, of unrest in these states, it was not the church that was at the forefront or the center of the calls for action or the civil unrest or the fight of injustice. They played a part, but they were not at the front. It was very evident that there had emerged some new organizers and new organizations like Black Lives Matter. This time, though, it seems the fire this time, particularly on yesterday, it seems that the organizers and the ones leading it were an overwhelming majority of young white justice lovers. What might Baldwin have thought about the vanishing role of the church, considering their influence during this type of social change during the 60s, and slightly away from Baldwin's thought? What do you think? What should the church do if it wants to be a relevant voice in this current fight for equality and justice for all. That's for both of you. I'll start with you, Dr. York.
Well, I think that one of the things that has, one of the problems that has been exacerbated in the past few decades has been the rise of what I will call the Bob Jones University mentality of fundamentalism, right-wing evangelicalism, which is a very oppressive form of Christianity. And it was Sinclair Lewis who said that when fascism comes to America, it's going to be carrying the cross wrapped in the flag. Now, Sinclair Lewis was married to Dorothy Thompson, who was the first American journalist that Hitler expelled from Germany during the rise of Nazism. The state church in Germany was in bed with the powers, with the empire. It was the confessing church like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was influenced by his time at Union, by his experiences in Harlem, and he chose to go back. So, as I see it, Baldwin today would not be surprised, I think, at the rise of this pseudo Christianity, which has wrapped itself in power with the empire, and Trumpism, precisely. I think that what can be done is what I've noticed that is different, and I'm not the first one to notice this, is that that the response is coming from a larger percentage of whites, including white academicians, Pentecostals, among others, who are seeking justice. They're beginning to take it more seriously. It's almost as though the holiness tradition never paid attention to the prophets. And Baldwin was a prophet like Jeremiah and like Amos. And so the prophetic edge has been missing. I do see a turn in that. I do see, for example, when Al Sharpton spoke, I don't know if you're aware of this or not. First of all, Al Sharpton has a Pentecostal heritage. Secondly, he spoke at an Assembly of God University in Minneapolis for the George Floyd funeral. And for the president of an Assembly of God college to announce that they're going to raise money for a scholarship called the George Floyd Scholarship and challenged other universities to do the same was remarkable. The church has been slow in addressing issues, particularly those who are not aware of what John Wesley would call social holiness. The Methodists had social holiness and personal holiness, and they saw both as being important. I mean, they led the fight in England against slavery, and they did a number of things. But the evangelicals today have gotten in bed with Trump, and I'm talking about the Prosperity Gospel Bunch. I'm talking about the Paula Whites who are on the staff of Trump, and some of these health and wealth people, and we need to clean up our own house. If I can say anything as a Caucasian minister this afternoon, we need to get back to understanding the whole gospel, including the Hebrew scriptures, and take seriously the words of Amos, for example, let justice roll down like mighty waters. I don't know if that helps, lend a perspective, but I think Baldwin would not be surprised at the position of the church. But I think it's going to take some prophetic leadership from the whites, and from my race, stepping up to the plate and not being afraid to be addressed by those who take a more conservative position. We just have to be prophetic.
Dr. Evans, I'd be interested in hearing your perspective on that vanishing role of the church in these times in some of the Social Justice Act.
Well, let me answer that, or at least start the answer in two ways. And I'm going to begin with saying that I believe it's fair to propose that Black folks are tired. We've been fighting since 1619. This is not the current episodes of the human saga are not an aberration.
Yeah.
This has been going on from the beginning of time for us. And so that could be a part of the explanation. The second part of it is, I got three things. Secondly, Black folks are tired of dying, right? Now, I'm not making an excuse if one should or should not continue to put his or her life on the line, but the evidence suggests if you do, you're going to be killed. Now, to your earlier point about white liberals being involved in this gyration, let us be fair that there has always been a small segment of white America who has been on the right side of history.
Yeah.
And that means as far north as Maine and the abolitionist movements, but there were also whites in the South during slavery that were on the right side of history. They understood that their white privilege was not to take the place of righteousness or ethical behavior. In addition to that, white liberals in the streets today, let's say it, they are still living in a white privilege because they're not in any way afraid that they're going to be shot and killed for marching. They have a different point of departure than most Blacks do. I mean, I think that's clear. And I think that needs to be said. I think Baldwin said in a letter, it was a letter from a region of his mind, and I believe it was published in 1960, maybe 62. And Dr. York will probably know that because he's really a better Baldwin scholar than I am. But whatever white people do not know about Negroes reveals precisely and exorbitantly what they do not know about themselves.
Right.
That is a profound statement. So that it suggests absence, right? Fatalism, right? Phobia, xenophobia, nihilism, right? There's this inability or unwillingness psychologically to see other as equal. And finally, Dr. York was spot on, man, when he talked about the evangelical church. And I'm just going to use these terms because I think these terms advance any conversation that other people will have long after we're off the air tonight. If we talk about evangelicalism of the North, just simply a high view of Scripture, an intellectual debate about the nature of Scripture is what evangelicalism at least used to mean, like the Gordon Conwells and those people up there, even Andover Newton in its early days, right? That's the Northern understanding of evangelicalism historically. That's on a whole different plane, man, from what we're talking about now. So we want to also say something to this effect, that The evangelicalism that is taken over in today in the American South has more to do with fascism and the white proletariat negotiating with elitist power. Again, going back to the class struggle, if you look at what evangelicals talked about today, the platitudes and the very easy answers and the lack of complexity in their theology, then what we're really hearing them say is, don't run over us. Remember, we're white. And so I think there are two things that are going on in this movement. One is a class struggle, an intramural scrimmage between whites, who I will say that are more liberation whites, and then the old guard of whites who are protecting their proletariat status in fear, right, that white supremacy or greed or materialism will also swallow them up. And so for a person who's like a homiletian here, where I learn and listen to communication skills and syntax, that's pretty much what I think we're listening to. We're listening to a sermon, a way of life that says, look, if these demographics continue to change, don't forget about us, because we've been carrying the water for a long time. Instead of saying we are being treated as poorly as Black folks, that should be the coalition. It should, at that point, if that ever happens, it will no longer solely be about race. The discussion will change.
That's something to ponder. The last two questions, one, they'll be specific. The first one is for you, Dr. York, and the last one is for Dr. Evans. Then there's one more I'm just going to slide in, but I'm going to ask us, I have about 8 minutes, 8 or 9 minutes or so left before we wrap up. But I want you to sort of answer them in your own way. Dr. York, what challenge, and I'm referencing the letter to his nephew, where Baldwin challenges him basically to convert his anger into some other passion that would allow him to live and exist beyond just his Negro experience. What challenge might Baldwin give, in your perspective, to this generation of young protesters out there about what to do with their anger?
That's a good question.
Why don't you go first, Dr. Evans?
No,
that's not for him. That one's yours.
Dr. York, you've been eloquent tonight, and we want to hear one more peroration from you before we go back to the hoop and hollering of my own tradition.
All right. Well,
don't test Dr. York. He can hoop himself.
Hey, I'll be glad to. Hey, look, give him a B flat. Let's go.
I think, first of all, one of the books that influenced my thinking goes back to 1964. It was Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, which won, I think, a National Book Award. And he takes on this whole mentality. So we are dealing with an anti-intellectualism, which was prevalent in Baldwin's day. It was prevalent in the Holiness Church. We're sort of getting out of it in some institutions in Pentecostalism today. I think the movement of the Society for Pentecostal Studies, and there's a new group that's emerging, Pentecostals for Social Justice. And I want to acknowledge what Dr. Evans said too, about there were white people involved in the 60s. Most of them were Unitarian Universalism. I think it was Reeve that was murdered. He was a Unitarian Universalist minister. I think the United Church of Christ was at the forefront on some of these issues. But there's a lot to be to be said. Give me that question a little bit again, please, so I stay right on track here.
Baldwin challenges his nephew to convert his anger. He says, as you sort of move through this,
Okay, I got you.
what
So,
what might he challenge this generation of protesters, regardless of race, to do with their anger?
all right. Well, I think that one of the things that I learned in my study about Baldwin as a leader was he was what Howard Gardner called at Harvard University in his book Anatomy of Leadership. He was an indirect leader.
Mm-hmm.
And he said the difference between a direct leader like a Dr. King and Baldwin, who I call an indirect leader, was the creativity and the arts. And so I think the artistic, that the anger and some of the things that are going on need to come out creatively. How can we be creative? You know, looting and tearing up places is not new. The day Baldwin's stepfather died, there was a riot in Harlem, not connected to his father. His mother is in the hospital giving birth to the youngest daughter. Her husband dies, and Baldwin goes to see his father to try and make some peace, which he accomplishes. But he's there when his father dies and stepfather dies. So I think that what has got to happen is, how do we take this moment and exert both direct and indirect leadership? And for some people, they're going to be organizing, they're going to be going out, they're going to be protesting appropriately, they're going to run for public office. That's all important. But then there are the other things. I got you smiling there, Slayton. But they're the creative arts. Remember, Baldwin was an artist. He was a master of language, and he created some magnificent works. And if there's anything I would plead to people of my race, is let's stop studying the Eurocentric theologians. James Cone talks about this in his final memoir. And let's forget Tillich and some of these other people for a while. And let's, with Cone, let's make Baldwin our theologian, because we've got to start with the existential crisis that we have right now. And I think that Baldwin speaks a prophetic word. He spoke it with, I'm going to use a Pentecostal expression, he spoke it with the anointing. They never understood why he was so articulate, but I believe it was a spiritual power that helped him to speak truth to power, and that spirit was the Holy Spirit. Right. Now, I'm not going to hoop on that.
I see Dr. York is about to get worked up.
That's a good word, too.
That was an excellent word. Excellent word. Dr. Evans, the second letter where he talks about religion, church, he has this moment where he talks about dinner that he has with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, which is very fascinating. I always like to hear personal stories where people met famous people. But in this one, it was interesting. He talks about that he felt that we had to create our own quote unquote black gods to sort of protect us or shield us from the oppression of the other gods that we had to live with. The question for you is, what are the modern day black gods that we've been unable to avoid, or have we created out of a necessity to try and avoid the weight of oppression?
Now, that's harder than any question I asked you at any time when you were a student, Dr. Slayton. And I think you, some in a Freudian way, you're trying to somehow get back at me. And I accept that. It happens from time to time. I'm going to tackle that. But look, may I just, I want to just say, this is the last question. I certainly want to say something very quickly to affirm what I think Dr. York was getting at. I want to remind us is that Black theology or liberation theology, we oftentimes say that it was born out of oppression. But let's also take another word and substitute it for a moment and say it was born out of trauma.
Right.
Black folks have been traumatized again since 1619. That's an existential reality, right? And Baldwin was traumatized as a child. He was
Facts.
told negative things about himself by his traumatized stepfather. His aesthetic was a white aesthetic for beauty that Baldwin had to deconstruct and overcome in order to find his unique self. He had sexual encounters as a child that was forced upon him, and therefore he was traumatized. And frankly, Baldwin spent a lot of his life, I think, trying to reconcile his identity with that crisis or that traumatic experience with the Pentecostal church, and frankly, what may have just been natural to him. I mean, I don't think Baldwin ever really reconciled those things. But let me tell you what he did do. There's a really good book that Henry Louis Gates published back in the 90s called Loose Cannons, Loose. In other words, loose the cannons from Western standards of beauty and estate to a counter narrative that other voices emerge. In other words, we read text differently and we write differently. Baldwin did that for all of us. Baldwin gave us a critique on Western letters that we had not had since the Harlem Renaissance writers, and these people overlap, but the Harlem Renaissance writers oftentimes used the Western literary canon and its syntax, et cetera, and then maybe from there they would take that thesis and then move into an antithesis. Baldwin didn't frankly care about their theses. Baldwin just said, look, I read everything you wrote, and now I am going to give you a counter narrative. Because Baldwin knew as long as we were the object instead of the subject, nothing changes. Now, I want to give a shout out very quickly. Eddie Glaude in Democracy in Black calls that the value gap, right? That there's a value placed on white estate that is not recognized similarly in Black estate, which will affect Black letters, will affect Black narrative, and will affect Black literacy, and will affect Black hermeneutic. It will affect Black rhetoric. It will affect Black theology. It will affect Black homiletic. It will affect Black intellectuals. Black life is still anti-intellectual. We need to, and that is a part of a problem. Now, I can't solve that tonight. I've been scratching my head now for more than 50 years on this issue, so don't act like I'm going to have an answer tonight. But I do think that we are still struggling with Black anti-intellectualism, similarly to what Dr. York described in Pentecostal traditions. We have some of that in our traditions as well. Now, using the word trauma and narrative and going forward, at dinner with Elijah Muhammad didn't go very well. The reading was that Baldwin was very uncomfortable with Elijah Muhammad's questions, and he didn't feel as though they were really having, as I remember it, an honest conversation where Baldwin felt he had liberty to critique and or disagree with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But he had a tremendous respect for Malcolm X or Malik Shabazz. He had a tremendous respect for his ability to admit that double consciousness functioned in Black life and took it head on. And that was and I think because Baldwin was from Harlem, as this, of course, is where Brother Malcolm took up residence and his message took place, that rang loudly to James Baldwin. So I don't know if it was so much about Islam as much as it was about how Islam was interpreted, because of, again, if you are a Muslim or a Christian and you're using white supremacist hermeneutics to read your text, then guess what? You're going to have a white sermon in blackface, right? You're going to miss it. And that's the similarity, I think, in that respect. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's all I can really try to tie together on your question, Dr. Slayton. And if I didn't answer it correctly, I really would like for you to give me extra credit, and I'll have it in next week.
I think I owe you that. Thank you both for taking time. I do have one more question. We are over time, but I'm going to ask you if you will engage me or give me at least a 1 minute response, just as a parting thought. What do you think Baldwin might have been had he not been a writer?
Dr. York, I'll let you tackle it first.
Well, I just want to say, if I may indulge for a few seconds here, I think that when you're talking about the black God, that one thing that has been tragic in white Christianity is that every picture of Jesus I have ever seen has been Caucasian. And, James Cone took that on. And I think we need to be, one of the verses of the New Testament that they seem to miss is out of Egypt, I have called my son. Jesus was a Palestinian Jew. He was dark complexion, and we need to get over that misconception. Now, having said that, what would he have been if he had not been a writer? I think that I think Baldwin would always have been a writer. What I do think, however, is that he probably would have. Well, he did speak a lot too. So I was thinking, well, maybe he would preach occasionally. I would love to see Baldwin's reaction today and take on a Freddie Price, for example, or some of these other mega wealth churches, and how he would address them. I have a hunch as how he would address them. But I think what I want to part with is that Jesus Christ is not white. And we need to get over that in American Christianity. We need to understand the Bible, and the hermeneutics that we have used have been skewed. But I think Baldwin would always have been a writer. I think it was in his blood. I think it was his calling. He told David Leeming, his biographer, he left the church. I think this is around page 250 in the Leeming biography. He left the church to preach the gospel. And I think that's what he did. He just did it at Berkeley. He did it in Birmingham. He did it in many places, but he was always the preacher. He didn't do it inside the institutional church. In some days, I wonder if we can do it in the institutional church. And with that, I defer to you, Dr. Slayton.
No, Dr. Evans, same question.
Well,
I think that was an amazing response, but
well, it was a tremendous response, and our right and honorable friend from Maine, if he weren't a preacher in the 21st century, he may have been like Joshua Chamberlain from the great state of Maine and won the battle at Little Bighorn, Little Round Top at Gettysburg, who was a Bowdoin professor. I think he went back to Bowdoin, became president of Bowdoin, and went on to be governor of Maine, didn't he?
He did. Indeed, you got your history straight, my brother.
Well, he would be proud of you, as I am tonight. I'll end with this, Brother Slayton. I agree with Dr. York. I think that if Baldwin were here today, the church perhaps would not be ready for him even now. And I think that Baldwin, as organized religion was not ready for the prophets of the Old Testament, as organized religion was not ready for Jesus in the New Testament, and even the apostles could not function, and therefore the church was born. So prophets oftentimes, as we all know, function very, very well outside of the institutions. And I think that's where Baldwin would be. I recall Baldwin saying that if he did not write, he would have committed suicide. And so I believe that, as Dr. York has said, he literally found his voice, and we are all better for it. And thank you, Dr. Slade, for having us tonight. I really dig this thing, man.
Thank you all, Dr. Evans, Dr. York. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I have enjoyed this immensely. I hope that those folks who will listen to this will enjoy it. I want to encourage them to read some of Baldwin's materials. I want to encourage them to be on the lookout of a modern writer. Professor Eddie Glaude, you probably see him on MSNBC or some other CNN, some news channel, but he has a book coming out on Baldwin, Begin Again. Be on the lookout for that. But anything you can pick up on Baldwin, check it out. It's just as relevant today as it was then. It speaks now, as Dr. York shared with us. But again, I hope this enlightens some folks, gives them some things to think about as we manage our way through the next few days. Dr. Evans, I just want to shout out your mayor publicly. Checkmate. Dee and I went over there and just walked the street. Amazing, amazing stuff. Gentlemen, both of you, thank you, thank you, thank you. God bless you.
I want to say thank you to Dr. Evans and to you, Dr. Slayton. It's been a privilege for me to be with such men of stature and scholarship, and I truly am humbled by the opportunity to be with you, Dr. Evans and Dr. Slayton, and I want to thank you before we go off the air.
Right back at you.
The feeling is mutual. And we'll do it again on some other topic. You brothers be blessed. Enjoy the rest of what weekend is left. I'm going to have a nice, relaxing evening.
I know what you're going to do.
Amen. Good night.
Good night. I don't know. Evans is brilliant.
He is brilliant. But so are you. Yep. I think he's really good. I really appreciate. I was surprised. I don't know why, but I was surprised that he was as good as he is.
Oh, he's